In this clip, we're going to deploy a container app to a container registry using Visual Studio. So first, let's create an Azure Container Registry, which is a location that holds containers. The containers don't get run from the registry. Azure Container Registry is similar to Docker Hub. Then let's create the container registry. Let's create a new resource group to hold the registry and the app service that we'll create later. And now let's give the registry a name. This needs to be unique across all of Azure for all customers because it gets suffixed with azurecr.io. Now let's select a region to deploy the registry to. And I'll leave this at the standard pricing SKU. Next is the networking tab. We can't make changes here because of the SKU we chose. And the same on the encryption page. We won't create any tags. And now we're ready to create this Azure Container Registry. If I navigate into it, you can see we have 100 gigabytes of storage available for storing container images. And if I go down to the Repositories tab, this is where the containers get deployed to. There aren't any here yet, so let's go back to Visual Studio and see how we can deploy this project to the registry. We're going to deploy using the Publish menu, and that'll build the container locally first, and then deploy it up to the Azure Container Registry. Before we try to create the Publish profile, go into your account settings, and make sure you're logged into Visual Studio with an account that has at least contributor access to the Azure Container Registry. Otherwise, you won't be able to connect. Publishing containers is a little different than code. It doesn't pull down a published profile, and it doesn't connect using the credentials you saw under the Tools menu earlier in this module. It uses this logged-in user account. I'm logged in with my Azure Administrator account, so this will work. Now let's right-click on the project and choose Publish. We're going to publish to Azure again. And next, we have a couple of options. If you choose to publish to Azure App Service Container, it's actually going to publish to an Azure Container Registry first, and then run the container in the app service, which is what we want. But unfortunately, this only works for Linux containers deployed to a Linux app service for containers. Since we created an ASP.NET project for a Windows container, we're going to use the other option here, to deploy to an Azure Container Registry. And then we'll configure the app service to pull the containers from there. Now let's select the container registry. There's only one in my subscription currently. And you can choose how to build the container image. Since we have Docker Desktop installed to run the image locally, let's choose that. And click Finish. That creates a Publish profile in the Properties folder, just like before. If we open that up, it looks similar to the other Publish profiles you saw. But the resource name is the container registry, and the username is blank. So again, Visual Studio doesn't pull down any credentials. When we publish the container to Azure, it's going to use the credentials of the user that's logged into Visual Studio. I've already clicked the button at the top to show hidden files, so we can open the other file that got created. And you can see there's no password being stored here. Now let's go to the Publish page and publish the container to Azure Container Registry using the Publish profile we just created. This will take a few minutes, so I'll speed this up quite a bit. But what's happening is that Visual Studio is building the container locally on this VM using Docker Desktop and the Visual Studio tools for containers. It does that by reading the Docker file and pulling down the base images for the container from the Microsoft Container Registry, so images with .NET and the .NET SDK installed already. Once the container is built, Visual Studio connects to the Azure Container Registry and pushes the container up to the cloud. It says it successfully pushed the container to the registry. So let's go back to the Azure portal, where I have the Azure Container Registry open to the Repositories page. Let's refresh this. And there's the container repository. So this is a place to hold copies of the container itself. If I navigate in, the container is here with the tag latest that was applied during upload. Next, let's see another way we can deploy the container using the Azure CLI. Now let's see how to upload source code to the Azure Container Registry using the Azure CLI. So in this case, you don't need Docker Desktop installed or even Visual Studio. We'll let Azure Container Registry do all the heavy lifting and build the container. We need to open up a command prompt and navigate to the folder with the source code. Since I'm in Visual Studio, I can do that by right-clicking on the project name and choosing Open Folder in File Explorer. That brings us to the project folder. Let's go up a level to the folder where the solution file is. And now by going to the address bar and typing cmd before the path to the folder, that'll open the command prompt right to this folder. You could open the command prompt the usual way and navigate to this folder, but this is just another way to get here. Now we need to log into the Azure CLI, and because we're going to be running a push command against the Azure Container Registry, the account we log in with needs to have at least contributor access to that repository. I'll use my admin account again, which is already logged into Azure. Now I'm logged into the Azure CLI. Back in the command prompt, let's clear this screen. Now before we run the CLI command, we need to make a small change to the project structure. Visual Studio created the Docker file in the root of the project folder. For the Azure CLI command to work, the Docker file needs to be in the parent folder. Otherwise, you'll get an error when deploying the code to the registry. So let's cut the file from here and paste it in the parent folder with the solution file. Now we can run this command AZ-ACR build and the name of the Azure Container Registry, then the name we want to give the image. The platform of our image is Windows, and end this with a period. So it's going to upload all the source code with the Docker file to the container registry and queue a build in the cloud. That'll run on a build agent in Azure, and the agent will pull the base container layers for the Microsoft images based on reading the Docker file that was uploaded. Then it will copy the source code onto the build image and build the project, then copy that onto the final image and store it in the container registry. I'll speed this up quite a bit because it can take a few minutes. It says the process was successful, so let's go back to the Azure portal, and we're still inside the Azure Container Registry, so I'll just refresh the view. And here's the new container that was just uploaded. Of course, it's the same as the one before, because we didn't change the source code, but it is a different container instance in a different repository in this container registry. Next, let's create an app service to host one of these containers. Now we have an Azure Container Registry that's hosting two containers that we've uploaded. Let's create an app service to host one of these containers. For hosting containers, we need to create a different app service plan than the one we've been using, and we need to do it at the same time as creating the app service. So let's go to the App Services shortcut, and let's create a new app service. I'll put this in the same resource group as the Azure Container Registry, but it doesn't have to go there. Now let's give the app service a name. And this time, we're going to publish a Docker container. And we'll choose Windows because that's what we chose when creating the project in Visual Studio. So the code and the hosting environment need to be compatible, or you'll get a runtime error. Let's leave the default region because I know Windows containers can be hosted here. When I tried to create this in the Canada Central region during testing, it said the requested feature wasn't available. It didn't tell me that until I tried to create the app service. That's probably because I'm using a Windows container. There seems to be a lot more support for Linux containers with app service, as I'll show you with the pricing tiers next. Remember, you can't host containers and code deployments on the same app service plan. Let's see what sizes are available. So because this is a Windows Container App Service plan, there's only premium pricing tiers available. Let's close out of this and take a look at the plans available for Linux containers. You can see there are standard tiers available, as well as basic and even the free tier. But we have a Windows container to deploy, so let's change this to Windows and accept the default premium pricing tier. You can delete this after testing, so you don't keep incurring charges for this app service. Let's move on to the Docker tab. Here we configure the app service to pull the image from the Azure Container Registry. But we could choose another registry, like Docker Hub or any private registry that's available on the internet. Choosing Azure defaults to the container registry in this subscription. Now, in order to access the container registry from this screen, I had to make a small change in the registry. I'll change over to this tab where I have the container registry open. On the Access Keys tab, just check the admin user. That allows the registry name to be used as a Docker login credential. Now, if I go back to the Create Web App Wizard, we can select one of the images that's been deployed to the registry. Let's choose the one that was deployed from Visual Studio, and if there were multiple containers, we could choose one based on the tag. Next is networking. We won't modify the defaults, and we'll leave Application Insights turned off. Let's skip tags and create this app service. It'll take a few seconds. And then we can navigate to the new app service. Let's go to the Deployment Center. Here we can change this app service to pull the containers from GitHub using GitHub Actions or from an Azure pipeline. We can change the authentication here, so the app service can connect to the Azure Container Registry, either using admin credentials, the default, which is a username and password configured on the registry, or we could configure a managed identity, which is like a service account for the app service, and then it grants that service account permissions on the Azure Container Registry to pull the container. It says SCM Basic Authentication is disabled for the app, and we have admin credentials chosen for the authentication type. So just like earlier with Web Deploy from Visual Studio, we need to enable this. Let's go to the Configuration tab and enable SCM Basic Auth Publishing and save these changes. Now when I go back to Deployment Center, that warning is gone. We can also set up continuous deployment here. So every time we publish a new container to the registry, App Service will get informed and will pull the new image and deploy it to this production deployment slot. Of course, we could set up a development slot also to receive the container. Let's leave these defaults and make sure the container was deployed by going to the Overview tab and browsing to the deployed site. So we've successfully deployed a container from Azure Container Registry. In this module, you learned about ways to publish code and containers to Azure App Service. First, we created a sample application in Visual Studio. Then we used the publish features of Visual Studio to upload the code to an app service. Then you saw how to zip up the application files and deploy them using the Kudu portal. Next, you learned how to deploy the zip file so the app service can mount it and run the code right from the zip file. After that, we used an FTP client to upload the code. Then we connected a local Git repository to a remote repository in Azure App Service, so App Service could build and deploy the application. Then we looked at deploying containers by first creating a sample application in Visual Studio, then creating a container registry and uploading containers to it. And finally, we configured an app service to pull the container from the Azure Container Registry. We've touched on continuous deployment in this module. In the next module, we're going to look at how to configure ongoing continuous integration and continuous deployment using GitHub Actions and Azure DevOps, two code repositories with the ability to deploy our code and containers.